The first thing Kai Arden noticed was the smell. Rotting wood, wet earth, smoke, and something underneath all of it, something harder to name, something like despair. His eyes snapped open, pain exploded through his skull, sharp and total, and for a moment he simply lay there, breathing through it. The last thing he remembered was the construction site, the crane, the screaming, the steel beam swinging wide in a gust of wind he hadn't predicted. Then darkness. Now he was lying on a wooden floor. He sat up slowly and the room tilted, his stomach lurched. He pressed the heel of his palm against his eye socket and waited for the spinning to stop, breathing in slow and deliberate counts the way he'd learned to do during long nights on deadline. In, out, understand what's happening, then move. This wasn't a hospital, this wasn't his apartment, this wasn't anywhere he recognized at all. The room was ancient, that was the only word for it. A cracked wooden desk squatted beneath a window that had lost most of its glass. Books lay scattered across the floor as though flung there in frustration. A rusted sword hung on the wall at a slight angle, its scabbard gone. Rain seeped through holes in the ceiling and darkened the floorboards in spreading rings, and the whole building had the particular exhausted quality of something that had given up on standing straight but hadn't quite fallen yet. What the hell? He tried to stand, and that was when the second wave hit him, not pain this time, but something worse. Images, names, faces, memories that weren't his flooding in all at once, a torrent of someone else's life pouring directly into his skull. He grabbed his head and staggered against the desk. Lord Kai Ravenwood, age 21, the youngest noble in the kingdom of Valoria. By the time the flood subsided, Kai was sitting on the floor with his back against the desk, breathing hard. He stared at his hands for a long moment. Younger hands than his own, smaller knuckles, different scars, a different body built by a different life in a world he had no business being in. I got reincarnated, he said aloud, because saying it made it real, and it needed to be real before he could deal with it. A knock interrupted him, 3 quick taps, and then the door burst open before he could respond. An elderly man rushed inside, thin, grey-haired, wearing the expression of someone who had been catastrophizing for hours and had only just started to believe it might turn out all right. He stopped when he saw Kai standing, and the relief that crossed his face was almost painful to watch. My lord. The memories supplied the name immediately. Edmund, the territory steward, one of the few people still loyal to House Ravenwood. Edmund, Kai straightened up and tried to look like someone who had not just spent the last 10 minutes having another man's life uploaded into his brain. What's? He heard it then, voices outside, not a few voices, many, angry, ragged, overlapping, the specific timbre of a crowd that had been patient for a long time and had finally run out. Edmund's relief collapsed back into misery. My lord, he said carefully, those are the villagers. Kai walked to the window. Hundreds of people filled the square below. Men, women, children, their clothes worn thin at the elbows and knees, their faces hollow in the way that comes not from a bad day but from a bad season. Several carried farming tools, not threateningly but almost absently, the way people carry the thing they were holding when they decided they couldn't stand it anymore. At the front of the crowd, a large farmer with sunburned skin and broad shoulders was speaking for all of them, his voice booming across the square. We want answers. We're starving. The grain stores are empty, where's the food? Kai turned back to Edmund. What happened? The old man looked away. That alone told Kai everything. The harvest failed, Edmund said quietly, again. How bad? A pause. We have enough grain for approximately 12 days. The room felt smaller immediately. Kai stood very still and let the number settle. 12 days, 317 people, 12 days. His engineer's brain started calculating without being asked: population, daily consumption, storage capacity, supply line distances, and every variable pointed toward the same conclusion. This wasn't a crisis that had just arrived. This was a crisis that had been building for months while the territory's lord hid in his manor. The treasury. Edmund looked embarrassed. 4 silver coins. 4. Yes. Not 400. No, my lord. Kai sat down heavily in the chair behind the desk. He'd managed construction projects worth millions on Earth, road networks, industrial developments, multi-stage housing complexes, and yet somehow he now found himself managing a territory worth less than a convenience store, with 12 days of food and 4 silver coins and 317 people shouting in the square below. A second knock came before he could say anything else, harder this time, urgent. Edmund opened the door and a young soldier entered, breathing like he'd been running. My lord, the royal messenger has arrived. Every instinct Kai had sharpened at once. The soldier unrolled a scroll and read it in a voice that trembled only slightly. The Crown hereby grants Ravenhill territory one final year to demonstrate profitability and self-sufficiency. Failure to meet these requirements will result in territorial dissolution. Dissolution? What exactly does that mean? Kai asked, though the memories had already begun to provide the answer. Edmund's voice was hollow. The territory ceases to exist, the villagers lose their homes, the land is seized, the population is redistributed, the noble title is revoked. The soldier hadn't finished. There is one final condition. He checked the scroll again. The treasury must repay outstanding debts totaling 20,000 gold crowns. The room exploded. Edmund made a sound like he'd been struck. The soldier flinched at his own words. Kai sat quietly while the noise happened around him. 20,000 gold crowns. The memories were helpful here too. 1 gold crown could feed a family for weeks. 20,000 was a number designed not to be paid. It was the kind of debt you handed someone when you'd already decided what you wanted the outcome to be, and you needed the paperwork to justify it. The king might as well have demanded they pay the moon. The soldier lowered the scroll. Outside, the villagers continued shouting. Inside, the last of the territory's possibilities seemed to be collapsing one by one. Then a sound rang through the room that nobody else appeared to hear. A soft chime and a glowing blue screen materialized in Kai's vision, transparent, sharp-edged, hovering in the middle distance like a heads-up display. Edmund kept panicking. The soldier kept sweating. Neither of them reacted to it at all. The screen read Empire Builder System. Host confirmed, Kai Arden, Territory Ravenhill, Classification Failed Village, Population 317, Treasury 4 Silver, Military 12 Guards, Food Supply 12 Days, Status Critical. A second panel expanded below it. First objective, prevent starvation, maintain population above 300, secure food supply, survive 30 days, reward, beginner territory package, failure, territory collapse. And then, in bright gold, welcome, Lord, from this moment forward, your kingdom begins. Kai looked at the shouting crowd outside, then at the empty treasury report on the desk, then at the crumbling village beyond the window, then at the system floating patiently in his vision, waiting. A laugh escaped him, soft at first, then genuine, because the situation was objectively absurd. On Earth he had spent a decade building things, roads, buildings, infrastructure for cities that barely noticed when it was finished. Now he had 1 year and 12 days of food and 317 lives that would end in displacement and hunger if he failed. And somehow, for the first time since the steel beam had swung toward him in the wind, he felt something that wasn't fear. Ravenhill wasn't dead, not yet. And if there was one thing Kai Arden knew how to do, it was build. The shouting outside hadn't stopped. Kai stood by the window for a while and simply listened, not to the words but to the tone underneath them, the specific pitch of human voices that have run out of patience and have nowhere left to put their fear except outward. He'd heard that tone on job sites before, when delays stretched too long and workers started wondering if their families would eat. Anger was almost always just fear wearing a louder face. The more he looked at the crowd below, the more obvious that became. Most of them were exhausted. Several children appeared genuinely thin. One woman near the back held an infant wrapped in old cloth, the baby's face turned against her shoulder. An elderly man leaned on a walking stick with both hands, his knuckles white. These weren't insurgents. These were people who had been failed slowly and consistently for a long time. Edmund was still hovering near the door. "My lord," he said, in the tone of a man who needed someone to tell him what to do. "What should we do?" Kai thought about the first thing he always did when a project went wrong. Not panic, not promise. "Just look. I need numbers," he said. Edmund blinked. "My lord. Everything you have, food, population, farmland, livestock, weapons, water supply, taxes, trade, every number, every record, every ledger, bring it all to this desk." For a moment Edmund just stared at him. Then something shifted in the old man's expression, a faint, cautious hope, like a door opening slightly onto light. It was the look of a steward who had not been asked to do useful work in a very long time. "I'll prepare everything immediately." As Edmund hurried out, the shouting in the square grew louder. Kai pulled on a jacket and went downstairs. When he stepped outside, the crowd noticed him immediately. The noise died by degrees, conversations cutting off mid-sentence until the square was almost silent. Hundreds of eyes fixed on him. He walked to a wooden platform near the manor entrance and stood on it, without guards, without barriers, without a speech prepared. Just him and the crowd and the grey morning light. Some of the faces looking up at him held anger. More held something heavier than anger, the particular flatness of people who have stopped expecting things to change. "I know you're hungry," Kai said. His voice wasn't especially loud, but the silence helped it carry. "I know you're scared, I know things are bad." A few people lowered their eyes, because those things were simply true. "I won't insult you with promises I can't keep. The harvest failed, our treasury is nearly empty, our food stores are running out." He let that sit for a moment. "But we are going to fix it." Laughter broke from somewhere in the crowd, bitter, disbelieving, and spread in ripples. The large farmer from the morning pushed his way to the front. His expression wasn't hostile so much as done. "How'd," he said, "with what money? We've heard this speech before." "I know you have," Kai kept his tone even. "You shouldn't trust me not based on words, you should trust results, and I don't have any yet." He nodded toward the fields beyond the village. "Tomorrow morning I want to inspect every field in this territory. Every well, every storage building, every road. We're going to find out exactly what failed and why, and then we're going to start fixing it." The farmer's eyes narrowed. "And if there isn't enough food in the meantime?" "Then we'll find food." It wasn't a satisfying answer, but it was an honest one, and the farmer seemed to recognize the difference, even if he didn't know what to do with it. A hand went up near the back, a small hand, a boy of maybe 10, looking up with the uncomplicated seriousness that only children can manage. "My lord, will we starve?" The question moved through the crowd like a current. Kai met the boy's eyes. "No." The word came out without hesitation, and when it did, he realized he meant it, not because he knew how yet, but because he was going to make it true. "No." The crowd dispersed slowly, not because they trusted him, that would take time he hadn't earned yet, but because something had changed and they could feel it. Their lord had come outside, stood without guards, told them the truth about how bad things were, and said he intended to fix it anyway. That was more than they'd been given in months. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. By late that evening, Kai had a desk covered in documents and a picture of Ravenhill that was even worse than he'd imagined. 317 people total, 186 working adults, 89 children, 42 elderly, 12 days of food, 4 silver coins, 12 guards, 17 functional farms, 31 abandoned, no active trade, no merchant traffic, no steady income of any kind. "Trade stopped 6 months ago," Edmund said, tracing a line on one of the older records. "After your father's execution, merchants stopped coming, businesses closed, the better-off families left. The ones who stayed are the ones with nowhere else to go." Kai nodded slowly. He could see the shape of it now, the logic of the collapse, a death spiral, each failure feeding the next. No trade meant no income meant no maintenance meant decay, decay meant further abandonment. He'd seen versions of this before in different contexts, and he knew that the worst thing about a death spiral was that every individual piece of it looked inevitable once it had already happened. But something in the documents caught his eye. He leaned forward. "The river." Edmund looked up. "What about it?" A river ran less than 2 kilometers from Ravenhill, close enough that it should have been a central feature of the territory's economy. Fresh water for irrigation, fish for food, a natural transport corridor for goods, yet almost none of it was being used. He scanned the records looking for the reason and found it in a single line buried halfway down a maintenance ledger from 3 years ago. "River crossing collapsed, reconstruction funds not allocated." One bridge, a bridge that had been broken for 3 years and never repaired because the money for it was always going somewhere else, and then eventually there was no money at all. Without it, farmers couldn't access roughly 20 abandoned farms on the far bank. Traders couldn't move through the territory efficiently. Fishing required a longer, harder route. Economic life had simply flowed around the gap and thinned out in the process. Kai sat back and thought about how many times he had seen exactly this on Earth. One piece of failed infrastructure quietly strangling the productivity of everything around it. A missing access road, a collapsed drainage system, an overpass that needed replacing. Small things that nobody wanted to fund because they weren't visible enough, until eventually their absence became the loudest thing in the room. Then the system chimed and a new prompt appeared. "Resource detection, 50 development points. Unlock." Kai selected yes without hesitation. The points vanished. A map bloomed in his vision, the territory laid out in translucent layers, fields and roads and the winding line of the river. His eyes moved north, toward the hills the villagers apparently called Cursed, and stopped. Beneath those hills, clearly marked, was an enormous deposit of iron ore. He stared at it for a long moment, then very quietly he started to smile. He barely slept, Not from anxiety, from the particular restless energy of someone who has found a thread and keeps following it mentally, past the point where sleep is interesting. Iron, not a magical windfall, not buried treasure. Iron, the most useful, most tradable resource in any pre-industrial economy. Weapons, tools, nails, hinges, plow blades, wagon axles, construction materials, every craftsman needed it, every army needed it, every growing settlement needed it. If the deposit was as large as the map suggested, Ravenhill wasn't just sitting on income, it was sitting on leverage. The question was how to get there from here, when here was 12 days of grain and 4 silver coins and 31 abandoned farms. The bridge first, he decided, the mine second. The bridge was immediate, it opened up farmland, which meant food, which meant buying time. The mine was the future. You couldn't build a future if the present collapsed around you. By the time the sun came up, Kai was already outside. The village looked different before the rest of it woke. Small fires burned outside doors. A few farmers were preparing carts in the early silence. Children carried buckets toward wells, some of them still half asleep. Life persisting anyway, the way it always does. Edmund emerged from the manor wrapped in a coat, carrying a stack of documents under one arm. He took one look at Kai's expression and said cautiously, "You appear unusually cheerful." "I think I found our first solution." The old steward glanced toward the northern hills. Something in his expression shifted. "Not the cursed hills." "What exactly makes them cursed?" "Nothing grows there, animals avoid the area. A few hunters disappeared years ago, people consider them unlucky." Kai nodded. "Perfect. If everyone avoided the hills, no one had ever gone looking at the rock formations closely enough to notice the color of the exposed stone." The group that left for the hills an hour later was small: Kai, Edmund, and 3 guards. The villagers watched them go with open curiosity. "Where's he going now?" Kai caught fragments as he passed. "Maybe he's gone insane." That last one came from one of the guards, apparently not quietly enough. Kai decided not to acknowledge it. The walk north took nearly 2 hours. The terrain grew rougher gradually, fields giving way to scrub to sparse trees, trees to open rocky hillside where the wind came across without anything to slow it. It was bleak country. He could see why people had decided it was cursed rather than simply unfertile. When the system overlay appeared with a distance marker, he changed direction. The guards exchanged glances behind him. He kept walking until he reached a stretch of hillside that looked no different from any other: stone, dirt, dry weeds. Then he crouched and looked at the rock. There it was, a streak of reddish-brown running through the exposed stone, the particular dull metallic sheen he recognized instantly. He picked up a loose piece and held it in his palm, and the weight of it felt like proof. "Edmund," he said, and handed it over. The old steward examined it. His expression went through several phases: confusion, recognition, and then something that looked like he needed to sit down. "My lord." One of the guards leaned in. "That's iron ore." His voice came out oddly flat, the tone of someone whose brain hasn't finished processing the information it just received. Nobody spoke for a long moment. They all stood on the rocky hillside with the wind moving through the dry grass and the weight of what they'd found settling over them slowly, because they all understood. Iron meant money, money meant food, food meant the 12-day clock stopped ticking. Then Edmund, ever reliable, collected himself. "My lord," he said carefully, "we don't have miners, we don't have the proper tools, we don't have the capital to commission them, and none of us know how to operate a mine." "Correct," Kai said. "So we have an enormous iron deposit, and no means of extracting it. For now." Edmund pinched his lips together in the expression of a man who had been hearing "for now" from nobles for 30 years, and had learned not to find it comforting. Then the system chimed again. A new prompt appeared: basic construction, available blueprint, small mine, cost 100 development points, unlock. Kai selected yes, and knowledge arrived. It wasn't a slow process. Tunnel layouts, timber support systems, ventilation shafts, drainage, or extraction sequences, all of it arrived in a compressed rush, like reading a textbook in 10 seconds. He stood very still until it finished, exhaling slowly when it did. "My lord," Edmund was watching him with barely contained alarm. "I know how we're opening the mine," Kai said. Edmund's expression suggested that this was either very good news or very bad news, and he hadn't yet determined which. That afternoon, the entire village gathered again. Word had spread fast. The Lord found something in the hills. What did he find? Nobody knows. Why does he look like that? By the time Kai stepped onto the platform, the square was full, and the crowd was different from the morning before, less angry, more uncertain in the way that people get when something might be about to change and they don't know how to hold it yet. He held up the chunk of iron ore. The gasps moved through the crowd in a wave. "We found iron," he said, "a large deposit enough to support this territory for years." He let that land before continuing. "But it will take time, several weeks at minimum before the mine produces meaningful income, and we don't have several weeks." The mood shifted immediately. Several faces that had lit up went cautious again. The large farmer crossed his arms. "So what does that buy us?" "Time," Kai said, "but not immediately, for right now the mine is not our first priority." He turned and pointed toward the river. "The bridge is." Silence. Then the farmer, "The broken bridge." "The broken bridge," Kai kept his voice level. "How many abandoned farms are on the far bank?" A pause. "Around 20. "And how much workable land?" The farmer thought about it reluctantly, the way someone does when they can see where an argument is going. "Quite a lot." Kai nodded. There it was. The bridge wasn't simply an infrastructure repair. It was a key to farmland that hadn't been worked in 3 years, to fields that could be producing food within weeks of being opened, to the 20 abandoned farms that represented the difference between 12 days of grain and something survivable. For 3 years, Ravenhill had been half a territory, not because of the harvest failures, not because of the debt, but because a single wooden bridge over a single river had collapsed and nobody had rebuilt it. Everything else had been a symptom. This was the cause. "The bridge comes first," Kai said. The farmer looked at him for a long moment. "Can you actually build one?" Back on Earth, Kai had overseen bridge projects worth more than this entire territory's annual output. Concrete arch bridges, cable-stayed spans, multi-lane crossings over rivers twice the width of anything near Ravenhill. Compared to those, a wooden bridge over a medieval river was a Tuesday afternoon. "Yes," he said simply. And for the first time, not completely, not yet, but genuinely and without the reservations they'd carried all week, the villagers began to believe him. The system updated as the crowd dispersed into the early evening, people talking in small groups, voices different now than they had been that morning. Main quest updated. Ravenhill restoration. Stage 1, discover resource complete. Current objective, rebuild river bridge. Reward 500 development points. Population morale increase. Territory prosperity plus 10%. Kai looked out toward the river, its surface catching the last of the light. Not an empire, not even a town. Just a bridge, wood and stone, and rope over a stretch of cold water. But every empire had to begin somewhere. And Ravenhill's future would begin here. 317 lives, 12 days, 4 silver coins, and one man who'd spent his entire career turning impossible problems into structures that held. The next morning, Ravenhill woke to something unusual. Purpose. For months, perhaps longer, the village had been drifting in the way that dying things drift, without urgency, without direction, each season stripping something away. People had stopped planning for the future because the future had stopped looking like something worth planning for. Every family made quiet, unspoken calculations about how long they could hold on, and most of those calculations ended badly. But something had shifted. Their lord had gone outside and stood without guards and told them the truth. Whether it led anywhere remained to be seen, but at least someone was trying, and that alone was enough to make people curious about what came next. Kai arrived at the river shortly after sunrise and stood for a while just looking at what remained of the bridge. Remained was generous. What he was looking at was more skeleton than structure, rotting support beams jutting from the water at odd angles, broken planks floating near the bank, entire sections simply gone. 3 years of neglect had finished whatever time had started, and the result looked less like a bridge that had collapsed and more like a bridge that had quietly given up. Edmund stood beside him, arms folded, expression doubtful in the particular way of someone who has lived through many plans and watched most of them fail. "Can it be repaired?" Kai studied the remains for a moment, then shook his head. "No, we'll rebuild it." Edmund made a sound like he'd been gently struck. "Rebuild." Repairing this would be more difficult than starting over. Kai began walking along the bank, and his engineer's eye went to work automatically, measuring the river's width by sight, reading the current's behavior around the exposed pilings, noting where the bed looked firm and where it softened. Infrastructure that had degraded past a certain threshold stopped being worth maintaining. It became cheaper to remove it and start fresh. This bridge had crossed that threshold years ago. He walked upstream for a moment, then came back, then stopped at a spot roughly 20 meters downstream from the original crossing. Here. Edmund frowned. The old bridge was further upstream where the river narrows. Which was the mistake? The steward blinked. A mistake. Kai pointed at the water. Look at the current where it narrows. It accelerates through the gap, more pressure against the foundations, more erosion at the base, more maintenance every season, and eventually more failure. He gestured at where they were standing. Here the river's wider, the current slows, less pressure, longer lifespan, less cost over time. Edmund stared at the water for a long moment, with the expression of a man putting together a puzzle he hadn't realized he was solving. "My lord," he said carefully, "how do you know these things?" Kai smiled. "Let's say I had good teachers." By mid-morning, nearly 50 villagers had gathered, not because anyone had ordered them, but because word traveled fast in small settlements and people wanted to see what was happening. Thomas arrived first, moving through the crowd with the unhurried confidence of a man who owns his ground. He surveyed the scene, looked at Kai, and asked the obvious question. "Where are the builders?" Kai pointed at the crowd. "You're looking at them." Silence. Several people exchanged glances. A woman near the front raised her hand with the uncertain energy of someone attending a meeting they weren't sure they'd been invited to. "We are farmers." "Correct." A young man spoke up. "I've never built a bridge." "Neither have most people until they do." The crowd grew visibly uncertain. Kai understood why. Bridge construction sounded like something that required specialists, guilds, years of training. But what these people had was time, labor, and reason to care about the outcome. That combination had built every significant structure in human history. He climbed onto a large rock and waited for the noise to settle. "We have a problem." A few people laughed, the helpless laugh of people who had been having the same problem for so long it had started to feel absurd. Kai let the laughter run out before continuing. "If we do nothing, we starve. The farmland across this river could feed us. Without a bridge, that land is useless." He let that sit, then pointed toward the far bank. "What do you see?" Tentative answers came back. "A river, trees, fields." "Exactly, not obstacles, opportunities." He stepped down from the rock. "Everyone talks about what Ravenhill lacks. No money, no trade, no food, no future. That's the wrong way to look at things." He pointed at Thomas, then at a woman nearby, then at a boy near the back. "We have 317 people. We have land, we have timber, we have stone, we have water, we have iron." That last word moved through the crowd like a current. The discovery was still hard for many to fully believe. "We already have everything we need to rebuild. The question is whether we're willing to use it." What followed wasn't the roar of a crowd converted. It was something quieter and more durable, the silence of people genuinely considering a possibility, not convinced, not yet, but thinking. And thinking was where everything started. Work began that afternoon. The first task was gathering materials, and Kai was surprised by how quickly the groups organized themselves. Loggers headed for the forest without being assigned to it. Farmers pulled carts into position. Young laborers appeared looking for something to lift. Even children found roles, carrying rope, fetching water, relaying messages between work areas. The whole operation had the slightly chaotic energy of improvisation, but it was moving, and that mattered. People wanted to contribute. They wanted to feel useful, to believe that their effort was building towards something real. Give them a clear purpose, and most of them would surprise you. The surprise of the afternoon, however, came from the south. 3 riders appeared on the road in the late hours, moving at an unhurried pace that communicated money and confidence in equal measure. Expensive horses, fine clothing, and the particular brand of smirk worn by people who had grown accustomed to finding other people's struggles amusing. They pulled up at the edge of the worksite, and the lead rider looked around with the expression of someone who had expected something worse and was disappointed to find it was merely bad. "Well," he said, "this is amusing." Thomas's jaw tightened. The villagers nearby went still. Kai stepped forward. "And you are?" "Lord Cedric Blackthorne." The name arrived with the specific weight of someone who considered it self-explanatory. A minor noble, a neighboring territory, a man who had built his reputation on being larger than the people around him by ensuring those people stayed small. Cedric's gaze moved over the worksite with something between contempt and entertainment. "A bridge? You intend to save Ravenhill with a bridge?" His companions found this funnier than it deserved. "Your father failed, you'll fail too." The villagers' faces darkened. Nobody appreciated hearing a dead man's failures discussed for sport. Kai remained still. "Do you know what people call this territory?" Cedric continued. "Enlighten me." "The Graveyard Village." More laughter. Cedric waited for some reaction, defensiveness, embarrassment, anger. What he got instead was a small, genuine smile, which confused him considerably more than any of those things would have. "Something funny." "A little," Kai said. He glanced at the workers, at the timber piling up near the bank, the foundation posts laid out on the ground, the dozens of people doing actual work in the afternoon light. Then he looked back at Cedric. "You see a graveyard, I see a construction site. The difference is perspective." Several villagers turned away to hide smiles. Thomas made a sound that was not quite a cough. Cedric's amusement cooled into something harder. "You aren't in a position to make enemies." "I'm not trying to," Kai paused. "I don't need to." "What is that supposed to mean?" "It means you're doing a good enough job of that yourself." The silence that followed was deeply satisfying. Cedric's face went red by degrees. For a moment it seemed genuinely possible that he might say something he'd regret. Instead, he yanked his horse around, delivered a final declaration that the project would fail and he would purchase the wreckage when it did, and rode away with his companions close behind. The moment they cleared the hill, the worksite erupted. Thomas laughed until he had to hold his sides. "You actually said that to his face." Kai shrugged. "He started it." That evening, as the light faded and the workers headed home, Kai sat alone near the water and watched the sun go down over the river. Progress had been slow but visible, materials stacked near the bank, foundation positions marked, basic plans drawn out on parchment. For the first time in years, something new was being built in Ravenhill. The fact that it was still mostly potential rather than structure didn't diminish that. He looked across the water at the far bank, dark now in the evening shadows, the abandoned farmland, the beginning of the path to the mine, the long road ahead. Ravenhill was still poor, still hungry, still one serious setback from collapse. But for the first time since arriving in this world, he could see a future taking shape in the distance. And it looked like something worth building toward. The bridge project entered its third day, and already the complications were arriving. Not catastrophic ones, not yet, but the kind of quiet, grinding problems that revealed themselves gradually, like cracks in a foundation that looked fine until you leaned on them. The first issue was labor, the second was food, the third was time, and the three were connected in ways that made each one harder to solve in isolation. Thomas arrived at the manor shortly after sunrise wearing the expression of a man who has been thinking about something unpleasant all the way over and hasn't found a better way to say it. "The workers," he said, "they can't keep this pace." Kai hadn't been surprised by that. Most villagers spent their days farming, not hauling timber and digging foundation holes. Bridge construction demanded sustained physical effort, and sustained physical effort required fuel. "How much grain remains?" Thomas handed him a report. The number sat in Kai's stomach like a stone. 10 days. In the 3 days since the bridge project began, they had burned through 2 days of reserves just feeding people working harder than usual. Edmund arrived moments later, took one look at Kai's face and reached for the report without being asked. He read it in silence, then set it down carefully, in the way people handle things that feel fragile. 10 days, the steward said quietly. The bridge would help, the mine would help, but both of those were measured in weeks and the food crisis was measured in days. The gap between those timelines was where people starved. Kai stood and looked out the window. Below, villagers were already gathering materials for the day's work, moving through the early morning chill with the determined energy of people who had decided to believe in something and were trying to outrun the moment when that belief might fail them. 317 lives, 10 days. He needed another solution, a faster one. Then something surfaced from the territory reports, a detail he had almost passed over. "The lake," he said. Edmund blinked. "What lake?" "The northern lake." Kai moved to the map table and unrolled charts until he found it, a body of water northeast of the village, modest in size but sitting on what the older records described as a historically productive fishery. He tapped it. According to this, it used to supply food regularly. Why did people stop using it? Thomas's expression shifted into something between embarrassment and reluctance. "Everyone says it's cursed." Kai closed his eyes briefly. "What happened?" "A few boats disappeared years ago. Bad weather probably, or strong currents. Nobody knows for certain, but people stopped going and eventually nobody went at all. An entire food source, abandoned because of a story that had grown in the telling until it felt like fact." Kai rubbed his forehead. Right now, with 10 days of grain left, he had considerably less patience for it than usual. "We are going to look at it." An hour later, Kai stood at the shoreline with Thomas, Edmund, several fishermen, and a small collection of curious villagers who had followed along out of hope or boredom or both. The lake was larger than he'd imagined from the map, wide and calm, the surface catching the morning light in long flat sheets. Birds moved over it in slow arcs. The surrounding area looked peaceful in the specific way of places that haven't been disturbed in a long time. Nothing about it suggested a curse. It suggested, if anything, a long nap. Then he noticed the water. Movement, not just ripples from the wind, but the deeper, purposeful movement of things living just beneath the surface. Large things. He crouched at the bank and looked more carefully and found himself staring at more fish than he had expected to see, dense schools moving slowly through the shallows, visible from shore. One of the fishermen exhaled softly. There are so many. Years without pressure will do that, Kai said. A fishery left alone long enough didn't just recover, it overcompensated. The lake had been quietly accumulating life for the better part of a decade. An elderly fisherman stepped forward, frowning. "My lord, I fished here 30 years ago. The population was never like this." "Because you were fishing it then." The old man was quiet for a moment, working through the logic, and something shifted in his expression as the pieces connected. Kai picked up a stone from the bank and tossed it into the water. It splashed, nothing else happened. He turned to the crowd. "The curse appears to have made other plans." A few villagers laughed. Thomas grinned, probably starved to death. The tension broke, and with it the last resistance. Hungry people, it turned out, could not afford superstition indefinitely. By midday, the first boats were on the water. They were old and poorly maintained, and moved with the reluctant dignity of vessels that had not expected to be asked for anything ever again, but they floated, and that was enough. The villagers crowded the shore and watched the first net go in. Several minutes passed. Then the fishermen strained at the lines, and the net came up heavy, and the crowd erupted. Dozens of fish, large, healthy, thrashing in the net with the specific vitality of animals that had never encountered a net before, enough to feed multiple families from a single pull. Children jumped and shouted. Adults who had been holding themselves together for months let it go. Some laughed, some cried, and several did both at once, because food in the end was not complicated. It was survival made simple, and they hadn't had enough of it in a very long time. The second net caught even more, the third and fourth more still. By sunset, hundreds of fish lined the shore. Thomas stood back and shook his head slowly. "We've been idiots." Kai couldn't honestly disagree. Then, while he was still watching the celebration, a second notification appeared, quieter but considerably more interesting. A merchant caravan, 2 days away, destination unknown. Kai read it twice. His mind began working through the implications immediately: trade, income, supplies, tools, information. A caravan stopping in Ravenhill could change the territory's trajectory in ways that fishing, however welcome, could not. The fishing solved the immediate crisis. Trade solved the structural one. The problem was that merchant caravans didn't visit dying territories. They had no reason to. Ravenhill would need to offer something worth stopping for. He looked toward the lake, then toward the northern hills, then toward the unfinished bridge. The pieces were there. They just needed to be assembled into something a merchant could recognize as valuable. The celebration that night was quiet and genuine, families cooking fish over open flames, children running between the fires, adults talking with the loosened ease of people who had just remembered that things could occasionally go well. Edmund appeared beside Kai on the manor balcony, looking more relaxed than he had since Kai's arrival. "My lord," the old steward said, "this is the first time I've heard people laugh in months." Kai nodded without speaking. Because he understood, even if Edmund didn't, that this was a single small victory in a much longer fight. The bridge, the mine, the merchants, the neighboring nobles, the kingdom itself, all of it was still waiting. But tonight, 300 people would go to sleep with full stomachs. And tomorrow, he would find a way to give them more. Kai was awake before sunrise on the day the caravan arrived. He had been awake most of the night, not from worry, but from the focused restlessness of someone running through contingencies. Merchant negotiations were their own kind of engineering. Load-bearing assumptions, failure points, the architecture of an agreement that had to support both parties' weight without collapsing. The basic principles translated across worlds with surprising fidelity. The dust cloud appeared on the southern road mid-morning, and the news moved through the village faster than Kai could walk to the gate. He stood near the entrance with Edmund and Thomas and watched the convoy approach. 8 wagons, approximately 30 guards, multiple merchants traveling together for security and efficiency. A respectable operation, not a traveling empire but substantial enough to carry real inventory and make real decisions. The lead wagon stopped. A middle-aged man stepped down, expensive clothing worn with the ease of someone who had owned it long enough to forget it, was expensive, sharp eyes that moved across the village with quick professional interest, the confident posture of a man whose entire life was spent evaluating things. His gaze settled on Kai immediately. "You must be Lord Ravenwood. And you must be the merchant." The man laughed, a genuine one, which was a good sign and a warning simultaneously. The most dangerous merchants were usually the most likable. Victor Hale. They sat inside the manor 20 minutes later, tea on the table, Victor's sharp eyes moving over the worn furniture and damaged walls, and leaking ceiling in the unhurried way of someone pricing things. "Interesting territory," he said. "Interesting good or interesting bad?" Victor smiled. "Both." He leaned back. "I've heard stories about Ravenhill. Most of them involve bankruptcy." Edmund looked offended. Thomas nearly choked. Victor continued without pausing. "But lately the stories have been different. A bridge project, an iron discovery, a food shortage that apparently resolved itself. People are talking." His expression became more direct. "The question is whether what they're talking about is real or whether it's the kind of hope that burns bright for a month and then collapses." "We've had some success," Kai said. "That's one way to describe it." Victor leaned forward. "The question I came to answer is whether that success can continue." So they began. The negotiations were more interesting than most Kai had experienced, because Victor was genuinely good at them, neither aggressive nor soft but precise. He asked intelligent questions about the bridge's timeline, the mine's projected output, the trade agreement with the fishing operations, the population trajectory. He listened carefully and made no comments that gave away his actual position. Kai found himself doing the same. Eventually, he simply asked, "What are you actually looking for?" Victor smiled. "Profit." "Obviously, what kind?" The merchant reached into his bag and unfolded a map, not just Ravenhill, but the entire surrounding region, with trade routes marked and economic activity sketched in with lines of varying thickness. He placed it on the table and pointed. "Do you know why no one visits this territory?" "Because we're poor." "Partly, but more importantly because you're isolated." His finger traced a route near Ravenhill's position. "The bridge you're building doesn't just connect your farmland, it sits in a corridor between 3 regional trade routes that currently don't connect efficiently. Once your infrastructure improves, this territory stops being a backwater and becomes a junction." Kai looked at the map more carefully. The point was correct. He had been thinking about the bridge as access to food, and it was that, but the location had longer-term implications he hadn't fully mapped. Victor had spotted it on approach, which meant he had been looking for exactly this kind of undervalued position. They negotiated for 3 hours. Victor opened with an offer of 500 gold in exchange for 10 years of exclusive trade rights, which made the room go briefly insane. Edmund actually fell from his chair, and which Kai declined without hesitation. Victor looked at him steadily. "No. No." A moment of silence. Then the merchant laughed, a different quality from before, something genuinely pleased in it. "Most desperate lords accept that immediately." "That's probably why they're desperate." They worked from there. By the end of the afternoon they had reached an agreement. 500 gold in exchange for preferred trade access, reduced tariffs, a 5-year contract, and first purchasing rights on future iron production. Fair terms that left neither side feeling cheated, which in Kai's experience was the only kind of agreement that held. Across the table, Victor was already discussing logistics with Edmund, who had recovered from falling off his chair, and was now taking notes with the focused energy of someone who had been waiting years to have something worth writing down. And in a manor on the far side of the region, Lord Cedric Blackthorne read the report about the 500 gold with the expression of a man who had bet on a horse he was certain would lose, and watched it win. He stared at the crumpled paper in his fist for a long time. Then he began making other plans. 3 weeks later, Ravenhill looked like a different place. Not prosperous, not yet. The poverty hadn't been solved, only redirected towards something more hopeful, but alive. That was the word that kept occurring to people, and they used it often because it was the most accurate thing they could say. The village felt alive again in a way it hadn't in years. The bridge was nearly finished, its clean new timbers rising from the water in deliberate contrast to the rotted remains they'd cleared away. The marketplace foundation had been laid, fishing operations ran daily, the treasury contained more money than it had in the previous 3 years combined. Children played in the streets again, Farmers talked about next season's crops with the speculative excitement of people who have started believing in seasons again. Small businesses discussed expansion with merchants who had started making Ravenhill a regular stop. The mood had changed in the bone-deep way that moods change when the underlying reality changes, not optimism as a performance, but hope as a reasonable conclusion. Success, unfortunately, is visible. And visible things attract attention, not all of it welcome. Lord Cedric Blackthorne was not sleeping well. He sat in his study with expensive wine he hadn't touched and reports he'd read 3 times each, and what occupied his thoughts was a single question he couldn't answer. How had a failing territory, with no treasury and no food and no credibility, turned itself around in a matter of weeks? How had a 21-year-old lord who had spent most of his tenure hiding in his manor suddenly become the kind of person people followed? It made no sense, and things that made no sense in Cedric's experience required intervention. He sent the servant for the men with cold eyes, and an hour later they were standing in his study. 3 of them, leather armor, scarred faces, the professional economy of movement that distinguished men who had been doing this a long time from men who merely thought they could. "I have work," Cedric said. Back in Ravenhill, Kai was standing inside the half-built marketplace when Thomas arrived with a look on his face that preceded good news. "The bridge," Thomas said, "it's finished." For a moment Kai simply stood there. Finished, the word had a different weight than any system notification, because this one came from a person who had helped build it. He followed Thomas to the river, and by the time they arrived, most of the village had already gathered. 317 people on the banks of a river looking at a bridge. Clean timber, solid stone pilings at the base, handrails on both sides, not a grand structure, nothing that would appear in any history but sturdy and true and built by people who had needed something to believe in and had made it themselves. Children ran across it first. Adults walked behind them more slowly, pressing palms against the beams the way people touch things they made with their hands. Even some of the elderly had made the walk from the village to be here. Thomas stood beside Kai and watched in silence for a while. "We actually did it," he said finally. "Yes." Neither of them said anything else because nothing else needed to be said. The bridge was proof, not of wealth, not yet, but of the more important thing, that the territory was capable of changing. The celebration lasted until a guard came sprinting across the new bridge from the north side, breathing hard, face stripped of color. "My lord, the northern farms." The joy didn't drain gradually, it went all at once. "Several fields," the guard said between breaths, "burned, the storage sheds too." Thomas swore quietly. The villagers went still. Kai's expression didn't change, but something hardened behind it, the shift from builder mode to problem-solving mode, cold and immediate. "Show me." The damage was deliberate. That much was obvious within the first minute of looking at it. Blackened earth in multiple locations simultaneously, not one fire spreading outward but several origin points, targeted with the precision of someone who knew the layout. Storage buildings, equipment, the specific infrastructure that would hurt the most, chosen by someone who had thought about it. Kai crouched near a patch of scorched ground and studied the tracks. Multiple men, horses, organized movement, disciplined spacing. This wasn't opportunistic criminal work, it was professional and commissioned. The conclusion was obvious. Cedric had the motive, the resources, and the timing. The problem was that obvious conclusions in political environments were not the same as provable ones. He needed evidence, not suspicion. Edmund arrived while he was still examining the site. "The villagers are frightened," the steward said quietly. "There are rumors that we're being punished for growing too quickly, for upsetting the natural order." Kai stood up. "We'll handle it." Edmund studied his face. "How?" "By understanding who did this and proving it." That evening Kai looked at the territory's defenses. 12 guards. That wasn't an army, it was barely a patrol, and everyone knew it. If someone wanted to cause real damage, nothing currently in place would stop them. His mind went to work on the problem the way it always did, not emotionally but structurally. What were the actual vulnerabilities? What were the cheapest effective interventions? How did you protect a settlement with minimal resources against an enemy you couldn't yet directly confront? The same principles that protected construction sites, he realized. Visibility, early warning, environmental control. You couldn't always match an enemy's strength, but you could make their movements harder to conceal and harder to execute without consequence. He began planning. And somewhere on the road back to his manor, Lord Cedric raised a glass and waited for the news that Ravenhill had panicked. He would wait considerably longer than he expected. The morning after the sabotage, Ravenhill was angry. Not broken, not frightened into passivity, though there was fear, and fear was reasonable, and the burned fields were still visible from half the village. What sat underneath the fear was something harder and more useful. Someone had attacked the things they were building, and that had produced in the people of Ravenhill the particular clarifying fury that comes from realizing you have something worth defending. The meeting room in the manor held more people than it was designed for. Thomas sat across from Edmund. Guards stood near the walls. The atmosphere was focused and slightly grim, the way war councils are even when they're very small ones. Kai spread maps across the table and waited for the noise to settle. The attack changes things, not just because of the damage, because it tells us something. Someone is watching this territory. Someone is organized enough to commission professionals and patient enough to wait for an effective moment. That means they're not finished. He tapped the map. Our biggest weakness right now isn't manpower, it's information. We don't know when threats approach, where they move, who's watching us. That changes today. The plan he outlined was deliberately simple, achievable without significant resources, effective within days rather than weeks. Watchtowers along the major approach roads, signal fires on the nearby hills preloaded and ready, patrol routes covering the territory's key infrastructure at regular intervals, scouts monitoring the forest corridors to the south and east. Thomas absorbed all of it and then said what he was thinking, and when we know something is coming, then we decide what to do with that knowledge. Right now we can't even get that far. The construction happened fast. 3 days and the watchtowers were up. 4 days and the first patrol routes were established, scouts learning the rhythms of the territory and what normal looked like so they could recognize what wasn't. By the end of the week, Ravenhill had eyes it hadn't had before. On the 4th day, those eyes saw something: armed men moving through the forested land to the southeast, not attacking, watching, circling, the behavior of a reconnaissance team assessing timing and position before a second operation. Kai received the scouts' report and felt something settle into place. They were preparing another strike. The question was when. Which meant it was time for the militia. Thomas surveyed the 32 volunteers assembled in the training field with an expression of resigned skepticism. Farmers mostly, with a handful of hunters, fishermen and laborers mixed in, ordinary people with no military background and varying degrees of obvious nervousness. Several were gripping their practice weapons in ways that suggested they had never held one before and weren't sure what to do with their hands. "My lord," Thomas said quietly, stepping close, "these are farmers." "Yes, sir. They've never fought." "Most soldiers haven't until they do." Kai kept his voice low. "I'm not trying to create an army, not yet. I'm trying to create 32 people who can function as a unit under pressure and don't freeze when something unexpected happens. That's achievable." Thomas looked at the volunteers again, this time with slightly less skepticism. The first day of training was, by any objective standard, a disaster. One recruit dropped his spear 3 times in quick succession. Another caught himself with a practice staff in a way that shouldn't have been physically possible. A fisherman who had presumably spent years maintaining his balance on boats managed to fall into a water trough. The entire village laughed for 10 minutes. Thomas didn't even try to hide it. The second day was better, the third better still. By the end of the week, something had quietly happened. The group had stopped being 32 individuals trying to remember instructions and started being a unit, moving with the shared awareness that develops when people train together long enough to learn each other's tells. They weren't soldiers, but they were no longer strangers to each other, and that mattered more than technique at this stage. Then a scout came in after midnight, moving like someone who had been running and hadn't stopped. He nearly went down at the manor entrance before the guards caught him. When he'd steadied himself enough to speak, he delivered 2 pieces of information. The first, the men behind the attacks had been located, approximately 40 of them, camped in Blackwood Forest, half a day's journey away. The second, this wasn't a bandit group. The numbers, the organization, the equipment patterns the scout described, this was a commissioned operation, funded and directed by someone with resources. 40 men, Ravenhill's militia numbered 32, their regular guards were 12. A defensive posture was survivable, but would leave them permanently reactive, always responding to the next attack rather than ending the threat. Kai had once spent an hour on a construction site trying to manage a series of accidents, before he realized that the only way to stop it was to find the person ordering the accidents and remove their ability to order more. The same principle applied here, but proof mattered. Accusation without evidence in a kingdom where Cedric had political connections and Kai had been in his title for less than 3 months would accomplish nothing. He needed to give it a different shot entirely. Slowly, a plan took shape. Not a battle plan. Ravenhill didn't have the numbers for a frontal engagement and wouldn't for months, but an engineering plan. Control the environment, reduce the enemy's advantages before they knew the engagement had begun. Tomorrow night they would set a trap, and whoever was waiting in Blackwood Forest for the signal to attack again would discover something they hadn't planned for. The rain arrived shortly after sunset, a light drizzle that thickened by dark into a steady curtain of water, transforming the roads to mud and turning the forest into a maze of shadows and close sound. Under other circumstances, it would have been miserable. Kai considered it excellent. Rain muffled movement. It drove scouts indoors and reduced visibility to a useful minimum. It made the world smaller and closer, which was advantageous for a smaller force that knew exactly where it was going and needed its movements concealed. Inside the manor, 30 militia members stood around the map and said almost nothing. The atmosphere was entirely different from training, tight and particular, the air of people who had arrived at the moment where preparation met reality and found the distance between them uncomfortably small. Thomas stood at Kai's shoulder, armor sitting on him with the same resigned awkwardness as most of the militia. They were farmers in borrowed equipment, and they knew it. Kai waited until he had the room's full attention. "We are not attacking." The relief in the room was immediate and visible. "Our objective is evidence. We need to capture the group's leader and find documentation that connects the operation to whoever commissioned it. That's the whole mission. We get in, we get that, we get out." He walked through the plan in detail, positions, timing, the specific funnel geometry he intended to create around the command tent using natural terrain features, and the patrol route gaps the scouts had spent 4 days mapping. The bandits had 40 men. Ravenhill had 32 militia plus the scouts. The math was worse than he'd like, but the math wasn't the point. The plan was designed to work around the math. Midnight, the forest was black and wet and loud with rain. The militia moved through it with the careful, slightly too slow caution of people who understood that a snapped branch could end everything. Kai moved with them, rain running down the back of his collar, mud pulling at every step. Beside him, Thomas's breathing was controlled but audible. "Nervous," Thomas murmured. "Very." Kai didn't look at him. "Anyone who isn't nervous right now is either lying or stupid." Thomas's exhale was almost a laugh. "That's comforting." "It wasn't meant to be." The scout at the front raised a hand. Everyone stopped. Through the trees, firelight flickered at irregular intervals through the undergrowth. The camp was close. Kai studied what he could see from their position. The layout matched the scout report's central fire, tents arranged around it, horses staked at the perimeter, 3 guards moving predictable routes. The equipment was wrong for bandits. The tents were too uniform, the weapons too matched, the guard rotation too disciplined. Someone had supplied and trained these men. The budget required for that kind of operation pointed strongly upward on the social ladder. Thomas breathed beside him. "The leader's tent. Center, largest one. And we're just going to walk in. More or less." Thomas appeared to consider this all right. The groups moved into position by increments, scouts to the perimeter, 2 teams blocking the primary escape routes, the main group fanning out toward the command tent under cover of the rain and darkness. It was the most complex thing the Ravenhill militia had attempted, and for approximately 11 minutes, it worked perfectly. Then one recruit stepped on a branch. The crack was sharp and clean and far too loud, cutting through the rain like a snapped rope. The entire operation stopped breathing. A guard turned toward the sound, one hand on his weapon. The silence stretched for several seconds that felt considerably longer. Then a deer burst from the undergrowth 30 meters away, sprinting through the edge of camp, knocking over a stack of supplies with a crash, and disappearing into the trees on the other side before anyone could react. The guard relaxed, just an animal, laughter spread through the camp, the tension unwound. Kai let out a very slow, very quiet breath. The recruit responsible for the branch had gone completely still and appeared to be reconsidering several of his life decisions. Kai made a mental note not to address this until considerably later. They moved on the command tent 60 seconds later. The leader was exactly where the scouts had said he would be, seated at a folding table, studying maps, wine in one hand, completely unaware. He looked up at the sound of the tent flap and got as far as opening his mouth before Thomas crossed the distance and introduced him to the ground via a chair that did not survive the encounter. The tent descended into chaos. The table went over. The wine went everywhere. Outside, the noise alerted the camp, and the situation changed from surgical to loud almost immediately. But the terrain worked the way Kai had designed it to. The paths leading to the tent were narrow, the escape routes blocked, the sightlines limited by the placement of the tents themselves. The bandits had numbers but couldn't use them effectively in the space available. Militia members who had stumbled over each other in training and fallen into water troughs were now holding positions with a focus that surprised even themselves. Because the difference between training and reality, Kai had found, was that reality had a way of producing clarity that practice never quite could. The fighting was short, messy, and ended in the militia's favor largely because the bandits hadn't expected resistance. They'd expected a farming village. Inside the tent, Thomas had the leader pinned to the ground with the professional thoroughness of a man who had spent 20 years moving heavy things. Kai crouched beside the captured man. "Let's talk." The man spat at him. "That's not productive." Kai began searching the tent, maps, supply ledgers, equipment records, and then in a locked box under the overturned table a sealed document. He broke the wax and unfolded it, a noble crest. His pulse quickened. He looked at the captured leader. The man met his eyes with the expression of someone who has decided not to cooperate, and something in that expression caught Kai's attention. Not fear, not anger, a kind of confidence that didn't fit the situation. "You'll be dead within a month," the man said. "Who hired you?" The man's smile answered the question by not answering it. "You already know." Kai looked back at the document. Then he began reading it in earnest, and what he found was not what he expected. Not a single letter. A payment ledger, detailed, methodical, covering months of transactions, names, dates, amounts, recipients. It documented bribes, mercenary contracts, arrangements that would have destroyed several careers if made public. Cedric's name was there. So were others, several others. Noble houses he recognized as influential, connected, the kind of people whose cooperation was required before any significant political action could succeed. Cedric hadn't been acting alone. He was part of a network, coordinated, financially linked, operating across multiple territories simultaneously. And the pattern of what they were doing when Kai laid it out against the territory reports he'd been reading was not random corruption. It was systematic weakening, territory after territory experiencing the same trajectory: debt, bandit pressure, economic decline, abandonment. Raven Hill had been one target among many. The militia returned home before dawn, muddy and exhausted and quietly triumphant. The captured leader sat bound in a cart. The ledger was in Kai's possession. The village woke to find its defenders coming home with evidence of a victory, and the response was the kind of unrestrained celebration that happens when communities realize they are not as powerless as they thought. That night, alone with the fire and the ledger, Kai read it again more carefully. The ledger was significant enough to threaten multiple powerful houses. That made it both an asset and a liability, useful as leverage, dangerous as possession. Anyone who knew he had it would want it back or destroyed. Ravenhill had just stumbled into something considerably larger than a border dispute with a petty neighbor. The question was what to do with that knowledge before the people who wanted it silenced him first. The royal invitation arrived 3 days later, and nobody in Ravenhill trusted it. The timing was too precise, the mechanism too convenient, the summons landing within days of the captured ledger, as though someone had made a calculation about Kai's next move and decided to control the venue. The messenger wore authentic colors, the seal was genuine, the parchment was real, none of that made it feel safe. Edmund read it aloud twice, voice careful and level. All nobles of the Eastern Territories were summoned to the Autumn Prosperity Banquet in Eastwatch. Attendance was mandatory. Absence would be interpreted as contempt toward the crown. Thomas said, with the directness of a man who had not grown up navigating noble politics, "It's a trap." "Probably," Kai agreed. Edmund made a sound of distress. "Probably." Kai tapped the invitation. If Cedric had the kind of authority this implies, he wouldn't be hiring bandits. Bandits are what you use when you don't have enough power to act directly. This comes from somewhere higher. He looked at the seal again, which is either better or worse, and I won't know which until I'm in the room. They went. Eastwatch was the largest city Kai had seen since arriving in this world, and it hit him with the particular visual weight of settlements that have grown over centuries, massive stone walls, watchtowers dominating the skyline, thousands of people moving through streets that had been shaped by generations of use. After months in a village, it was almost disorienting. Thomas stared from the carriage window without apology. Edmund looked at the city with the practiced appreciation of a man who had traveled more. Kai looked at the pattern of wealth distribution, luxury carriages and private guards in certain districts, slums visible just outside the main gates, the gap between them wide enough to suggest it was not an accident. Different world, same architecture of inequality. The governor's palace banquet was the kind of event designed to demonstrate power through excess. Crystal chandeliers, gold fixtures, imported foods arranged on tables that would have fed Ravenhill for a week, musicians, more servants than guests. The whole thing had the slightly airless quality of luxury that has become so normal to its participants that it no longer communicates anything except its own continuity. Kai entered and immediately felt the shift in the room, conversations slowing, eyes following him, the particular quality of attention given to someone people have been discussing in their absence. The whispers were audible: the bridge builder, the Ravenhill lord, the iron discovery, the merchant contract. His reputation had arrived before him. Cedric noticed him from across the room. His expression communicated with considerable economy that this was not a welcome surprise. Kai spent most of the next few hours watching more than participating. Nobles drank, networked, formed alliances, subtly betrayed them, made promises they had varying intentions of keeping. Standard politics. But the conversations he could hear in passing told a more interesting story. The Eastern Territories were struggling broadly. Debt, bandit pressure, economic decline, failing harvests, the same symptoms appearing across multiple regions simultaneously. The ledger began making more sense in a new way. Governor Roland Ashford found him on a balcony overlooking the city. The man was older than Kai had expected, silver-haired, calm-eyed, with the watchfulness of someone who had spent decades paying attention to rooms and had learned to read them completely. He surveyed the city below for a moment without speaking, then said without preamble, "You found the ledger?" Kai kept his face still. Interesting assumption. "Not really." Roland looked at him sideways. "I've been investigating the same network for years. The pattern of your recent actions suggested you had obtained documentation." He turned back to the view. "I was right." Kai studied him carefully. "What are you going to do about it?" "That depends on what you're going to do about it." Roland paused. "Don't expose Cedric tonight. That was your plan, I assume." "Why not?" "Because Cedric is a pawn, a useful one to someone much more careful. Exposing him publicly achieves nothing except warning the person above him to cover their tracks more thoroughly." Roland turned to look at him directly. "I need the network, not a single node." "And you trust me with that information because you've spent 3 months rebuilding a dying territory instead of finding ways to exploit it, and people who do that tend to care about outcomes." The governor's expression didn't change. "I could be wrong. I've been wrong before." Kai absorbed this. Who is it, the person above Cedric? For the first time, something that might have been frustration crossed Roland's face. "If I knew that, we wouldn't be having this conversation." They returned to the hall before midnight, just in time to witness the doors blow open with a concussive boom that silenced every conversation simultaneously. A messenger stumbled in, covered in road dust, on his knees before the governor before he'd fully stopped moving. The northern frontier had fallen, monster attacks, border forts overrun, thousands of people fleeing south. The hall erupted, questions and shouts and the particular sharp panic of people who live in luxury and have just been reminded that the world contains things indifferent to it. Governor Roland's voice cut through the noise with practiced authority and the room quieted, but the damage was done, the information was in the air, and everyone was already computing their own position in relation to it. Kai was computing something else. He moved through the crowd slowly, watching faces, and what he noticed in several of them was not shock. It was anxiety, the measured, pre-existing kind, the kind you have when you already knew something was coming and had been hoping it wouldn't arrive quite yet. Several nobles in this room had known about the northern frontier before tonight, which meant the collapse wasn't as sudden as it was being presented. And if it wasn't sudden, then the pattern of territory weakening, debt accumulation, and economic extraction he'd seen in the ledger took on a different shape entirely. He left Eastwatch that night with considerably more questions than he'd arrived with. The journey back to Ravenhill took 2 days, and during those 2 days Kai saw the future laid out on every road he traveled. Not in the scenery, in the people. They moved south in the way that disaster moves people, not in orderly columns, but in the asymmetric, exhausted scatter of families who had made the decision to leave with whatever they could carry and however much of a head start they could get. Old men with walking sticks. Women with infants, children carrying packs that were clearly too heavy, carts overloaded past the point of efficiency, moving slowly through mud. The road had become a river of displacement, and it stretched further back toward the horizon than Kai could see. Other nobles viewed this as a problem to be managed, contained, redirected. Their gates were already closing. Kai looked at 300 families walking toward an uncertain destination and saw something entirely different. Ravenhill appeared different on approach. The roads near the village were busier, groups of travelers lingering at the territory's edge, several tents that hadn't been there before, the particular quality of movement around a place that people were treating as a destination rather than a waypoint. A guard met them on the road, grinning. "They're coming because of Ravenhill," the guard said. "They heard about the bridge, the fishing, the trade agreement. While everyone else is turning people away, word got out that we are not." Kai looked at the tents, at the families moving toward the village gate, and felt something click into focus. He hadn't needed to recruit. The territory's reputation had done it without him. The meeting room argument lasted an hour and didn't fully resolve. "We cannot feed thousands," Edmund said, and the number in his voice was real, not political caution but genuine logistical alarm. Thomas backed him. Several merchants pointed out that other lords were closing their gates precisely because the math didn't work. Kai waited for the arguments to exhaust themselves, then asked one question. "What does Ravenhill need?" Thomas answered first, reluctantly, "Workers." "What else?" "Farmers, builders, merchants." "And what are refugees?" The silence that followed was the productive kind, the silence of people working something out. Not every person fleeing the frontier would have skills Ravenhill could use immediately, but many would, possibly most. The population wasn't just mouths to feed, it was potential labor, potential production, potential tax base, arriving already motivated by the need to rebuild somewhere new. Construction began immediately, and the newcomers arrived alongside it. One family at first, then 5, then 10, then dozens. Many brought skills the village had been lacking: blacksmiths, carpenters, stoneworkers, hunters who knew the northern terrain and were accustomed to feeding themselves from it. People who had lost everything except what they knew how to do. Kai watched the village physically change around him. New homes going up, new workshops opening, new farm plots being broken on the expanded irrigation land. Thomas stood at one point in the middle of the market square, watching the activity in every direction, and said simply, "This doesn't look like a village anymore." He was right. Ravenhill had outgrown the category, while no one was paying specific attention. The mine activated during the same period, the first real ore carts emerging from the excavation with the slightly theatrical timing of something everyone had been waiting for. The workers cheered. The mine manager cried. Kai allowed himself 30 seconds of satisfaction and then started thinking about the forge. "If we sell ore, we earn money," he told Thomas. "If we sell finished tools, we earn more. If we sell weapons and equipment to people who are currently watching a war approach their borders, we earn significantly more." Thomas worked through the arithmetic and arrived at the same conclusion with approximately the same expression as someone realizing they've been doing something inefficiently for years. Blacksmiths began arriving from neighboring territories within the week, drawn by the combination of raw ore, growing population, and the specific gravity of a place that was visibly moving in one direction. Then the scout arrived after midnight. The northern frontier hadn't collapsed under pressure, it had been abandoned. The nobles had retreated, the soldiers had withdrawn, the frontier cities had been left to the approaching threat, while the people who were supposed to defend them quietly relocated southward and called it a strategic withdrawal. The consequence of that decision was now moving south, toward the populated regions, toward Eastwatch, toward Ravenhill, toward everywhere. 6 months, Kai looked at the growing town outside his window, the market, the workshops, the new homes, the mine, the bridge still crossing the river that had started all of it. 6 months to transform this from a recovering village into something that could withstand what was coming. The system called it a refugee crisis. The scouts' information suggested it was the opening stage of something considerably larger, and the pattern in the ledger, the deliberate weakening of territories across the region, suggested someone had expected this, or arranged it, or both. He began making a list of everything Ravenhill needed that it didn't yet have. The list was long. The news about the approaching threat spread the way news spreads in small communities, faster than horses, with significant editorial embellishment at each retelling. By the end of the week, estimates of the monster numbers ranged from 100 to 10,000, and one fisherman had become genuinely convinced that a dragon was leading the advance. Nobody fully believed that. Nobody entirely dismissed it either, because the northern frontier had fallen, and that was real, and the gap between real and dragon was smaller than it had been a month ago. Kai managed the anxiety by doing what he always did with anxiety, converting it directly into work. The marketplace opened first and the effect was immediate. The stalls filled within days: food vendors, a blacksmith, a carpenter, two tailors, a woodworker who specialized in tool handles, a woman selling dried herbs from a cart who became, for reasons that were never entirely clear, one of the most consistently busy merchants in the square. The village center transformed into something with genuine economic gravity. Travelers who stopped to trade started staying. Seasonal workers who had come for the harvest began building houses rather than returning home. Thomas watched the activity from the edge of the square one afternoon and said quietly, "3 months ago we were starving." "3 months ago you thought the lake was cursed," Kai reminded him. Thomas made a sound of dignified acknowledgement. The forge followed the marketplace, and its construction generated more argument than the bridge had, though of a different kind. Several aldermen were worried about the cost. Several merchants were worried about the competition. Edmund was worried about the liability of operating a forge during a period of general regional instability, which was a concern Kai filed under accurate but unhelpful. The core logic was simple: raw ore created income, processed goods created more income, finished weapons and equipment sold to a region that was preparing for war, whether it knew it yet or not, created the most income of all. Ravenhill had the ore. It needed the capacity to do something with it beyond dig it out and hand it to Victor Hale at a discount. The forge was built. The royal letter arrived on a grey afternoon. Edmund brought it to the desk with the careful handling of something he suspected was dangerous. By order of the Crown, Royal Inspector Marcus Valen would arrive within 14 days to assess Ravenhill territory. The inspector would determine whether the territory qualified for official advancement. Failure to meet standards would result in penalties. Success would result in promotion to township status. The reaction in the manor was immediate and disproportionate. Guards paled. Edmund looked like he'd been handed a death sentence with good penmanship. Thomas had to have the procedure explained to him, after which he also looked alarmed. "Royal inspectors," Edmund said, with the gravity of a man sharing hard-won institutional knowledge, "are terrifying. Inspector Valen in particular. He rejects nearly everyone, finds problems in perfectly functional territories. Several lords have lost their titles based on his assessments." Thomas frowned. Can he really be that bad? Edmund looked at him. 2 years ago he assessed a territory that had doubled its trade income and called it administratively deficient. Kai spent the next 2 weeks converting anxiety into paperwork, which was approximately as satisfying as it sounds. Road condition reports, tax ledgers, population registration, workplace safety assessments for the mine and the forge, infrastructure maintenance logs, business licensing records. The kingdom ran on documentation, and Ravenhill had been too busy surviving to keep its documentation in order. Inspector Marcus Valen arrived on the 14th day and was immediately confusing. He was younger than the reputation suggested, early 30s, ordinary clothing, the calm expression of someone with no particular investment in being impressive. His eyes, however, were the sharp, practical kind that missed nothing and communicated the fact clearly. Kai greeted him and found himself being assessed within 10 seconds of the handshake without any visible assessment occurring. What followed was 8 days of thorough, exhausting, comment-free scrutiny. The bridge, the mine, the forge, the marketplace, the irrigation canals, the watchtower network, the records, the finances, the militia training log, the fishing operations, everything was examined with the same level of careful attention, and none of it produced any visible reaction from Marcus. He simply looked, noted, moved on. Villagers who had been nervous became more nervous. Even Kai felt the slow pressure of waiting for a verdict from someone determined not to telegraph it. On the 8th day, Marcus requested a private meeting. Everyone in the manor pretended not to notice that this was significant. He sat across from Kai with several documents on the table between them and was quiet for a moment before speaking. "You're not from here." Kai kept his voice measured. "What makes you say that?" "Your decision-making, the way you approach problems, the sequencing, the resource prioritization, the attention to infrastructure before economics. It's systematic in a way that's unusual for this region." Marcus's expression was neutral, impossible to read. "Where did you learn it?" "I had good teachers." The inspector studied him for another moment, then did something unexpected. He smiled, a real one, the first anyone in Ravenhill had witnessed. "Good answer." He picked up the top document from his stack. "Ravenhill qualifies. You're functioning as a town already. The designation is catching up to reality." Relief moved through the room like a change in air pressure. Kai let out a breath he hadn't entirely realized he was holding. Then Marcus's expression shifted, and the relief became complicated. The real reason I came isn't the inspection. He placed a sealed document on the table, black wax, an unfamiliar crest. The Crown has received the same reports I received. The northern frontier, the migration patterns, the military assessment. He paused. The kingdom is preparing. For what? Marcus looked at him steadily. The monsters aren't migrating, they're invading. There's a difference, and the Crown has accepted it. He stood and moved toward the door, then stopped. By the way, Kai looked up. Marcus smiled faintly. Congratulations. 178 days. Kai sat with the number for a while, not paralyzed by it. There was too much to do for paralysis, but genuinely reckoning with what it meant. Less than 6 months. 6 months to build walls, to train soldiers, to produce enough weapons and food to outlast a sustained assault, to transform a town that had been 4 months ago a dying village into something capable of surviving a war. He looked out at Ravenhill, the market stalls lit in the evening, the forge smoke rising in a steady column, the sound of construction carrying from 2 different sites simultaneously, the bridge over the river that had started all of it. Everything they had built. Everything that was still being built. The countdown had started. And now, for the first time, survival meant more than feeding 300 people through a hard winter. It meant becoming something that could hold. He opened his planning notes and began writing. A dying village, a borrowed life, a war no one had prepared for, and one man who had learned, somewhere along the way, that the difference between a graveyard and a construction site was simply the decision to pick up a tool.